Wonderful. Welcome, Pierre. Thank you so much. So we have Pierre Wunsch today. So this is only, I think, the second fireside chat that I'm doing. There's no fireside, and we will fix that. And I think what these two have in common, the previous one with Olli Rehn, is that I seem to like to attract sort of unusual central bankers of one kind or the other, but as you will probably notice during this conversation, particularly if you listen to the last one, is that Pierre Wunsch is unusual in different ways in which Olli Rehn is unusual. And so, one of the ways in which Pierre is unusual is he is rather outspoken for a central banker. He does not beat about the bush. He has broad interests. Sometimes you even get the impression he does not think that monetary policy is the most important thing in life, maybe the second most important, but perhaps not the most important. Third, he has a very unusual and interesting and broad background. And so the background starts, he's trained as an economist, and you feel that definitely when you speak to him. He worked in a technical capacity in the Belgian Planning Bureau for a relatively brief period, and then for the most part you worked in sort of at the intersection of Belgian politics and economic policy, so in cabinet type positions. Your sort of most recent cabinet position was, I think, as chief of staff to Didier Reynders from 2008 until 2011, but in the middle, there was also a very interesting stretch in the private sector, where you worked for an energy company for about 8 years. And, sometimes the way you talk about energy, I'm thinking that maybe you were inspired by that. But then you told me that already your undergraduate thesis was on climate, very unusually, your maîtrise de licence. And so, fundamentally, the question is, how should we put this biographical picture together in understanding who you are today? So what has influenced you the most? I mean, the last stretch of your career is well known. So you joined the central bank as a directeur, as one of the members of the board. I think six members of the board, and then eventually became the vice governor, and now the governor. And so help us understand Pierre Wunsch.
Oh wow, what a challenge. My wife is a psychologist, I'm trying with her every day, but the way I look at it is, first, I never had a career plan, so that's maybe reassuring for all of those listening that don't have a career plan. It's possible to make a beautiful career without one. And in a way, my career doesn't make any sense, and the only dynamics behind it was that I'm a curious person, and I'm interested in many things, and if there are intellectual challenges and things to understand, I like it. But I worked a little bit more or less in politics. I've a thesis in a PhD in economics, so I did, part of my career was more of an academic one. I didn't publish much, but and then I worked in the private sector. And honestly, if you were looking at that, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But being a governor and having those three experiences at the end of the day is useful, because having some understanding for political constraints and how politics work in this world, where a lot of things are about politics, is, I think, useful. I was not a politician myself, but I guess I know a little bit about it. Having worked in the private sector, I think, gives you, some experience also in terms of managing a company. 2,000 people at the National Bank of Belgium, but also maybe some better understanding of the constraints in the private sector. And, having a PhD in economics, being a central banker is maybe not such a bad idea.
So I thought on the substance we should start off with, the subject which probably worries me most, and I know it worries you a lot, which is climate change. And, you're certainly the central banker that I know that knows most about climate change among all the central bankers that I know, and you do know a lot by absolute standards. And for people who are not familiar with Pierre's work on this, he delivered a fantastic lecture at a conference on climate and macroeconomics, organized by our friend Jean Pisani-Ferry at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. last June, and this is, of course, published and will come out in a very impressive volume that Jean is editing. And so, I mean, roughly speaking, we have, with great simplification, there's a sense that in an aspirational way, we're trying to do the right thing in Europe. We are certainly the party in the sense of the COP. We are not a country, the EU is not a country, we are a party that is sort of on the most ambitious side of climate mitigation. But there seem to be two important obstacles. One is we're not alone, of course, internationally. So even if we do what we hope to do, we will still have a big problem unless we get more mitigation. And the problem with that is that this more mitigation will need to happen not just in places like the US, but in places that have relatively low per capita emissions now. So that's one dimension. But the other dimension is that, and I don't know whether this is surprising or not, maybe we thought at some point that as, we formulate an ambitious plan, in the meantime, there's more evidence, there are more floods, there are more droughts, there are more heat waves, and then we get everyone to coalesce about this plan, and in a sense, as time passes, it becomes easier to implement politically, not more difficult. Now, it doesn't look like that if you look at polls and, at yellow vests and at farmers in Germany, and so something seems to have gone wrong in that respect. And so my big worry is that, this plan that we have might not be ambitious. It's certainly not ambitious on its own, but the implementation is increasingly dubious. And so the question is, how do you see that? Did we make mistakes? What should we be doing now?
Yeah, good questions. The way I would go about it is the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good part of it is I'm on, with those that are optimistic on the technology front. And actually, at the end of the day, I think it's going to trump all the rest. We need technology, and it's moving fast, and it's moving in the right direction. I guess there is a consensus, more or less, right now that it is a shock, so it will have a negative impact on growth, at least for the next 2 or 3 decades. Very long run, I don't know. But it's probably about something like 3% of GDP, the typical oil shock, spread over 25 years, that's 0.1% of GDP per year. So from a macro point of view, it is manageable. And of course, some sectors will be more impacted than others, and it's a big challenge. The way I put it was it's the first policy-driven industrial revolution, which makes it difficult because you still depend on policy to be there and give clear signals. The problem, there is a trade-off between giving clear signals and being flexible on the political front. Because if your signals are clear but rigid and you hit a wall, then you lose 10 years. So it's that part is difficult. So that's the good one. I can come back to it, but I'm a technology optimist. And from a macro perspective, it's manageable. The bad is the international dimension. We thought that the US and others, because it's reasonable, would go for carbon price. We are economists, so we are all for carbon prices. And they don't do it, they go for subsidies. And of course, if we go for carbon pricing, they go for subsidies, it's a double whammy in terms of relative prices. And I can come back to that, but it's basically, US gas at €10 compared to decarbonized fuels in Europe, which will be, between 5 to 10 times more expensive. So that's a big issue. And I don't think CBAM is going to be enough to solve that problem. So that's the bad, and the ugly is, I think, the political one. Now, we knew it. I mean, there are studies about what people are willing to pay in terms of climate. If people had paid attention, and even talking to people, in the green movement and so on, they look at that. So we knew it. And I'm not surprised that farmers are in the streets, and I could make bets that a lot of people are going to be in the streets in Europe in the coming years. And there, indeed, I believe we've been in denial. We've not done our homework. And I'm not pleading for retreat. I'm not pleading for, stopping. But it's a challenge. So you need to do your homework, understand when you impose things to people, and they honestly don't have a solution, because it is one thing to impose a heat pump for a new house. Maybe you want to do that. Imposing a very high level of insulation and maybe heat pumps for all the houses, it's not always possible. You don't have the people and so on. I mean, today I'm meeting a lot of people from the Commission and the ECB telling me, you know, I saw this house at 400,000 euro. Not everybody's looking for a house at 400,000 euro, but 200,000 euros of works for insulation, that's expensive for me. Well, if people from the Commission see it as a problem, a lot of people in Europe are going to see it as a problem. So we need to look at that, do our homework, see what is going to be the impact on people. Because if we wait for people to be in the streets to tell us that they have a problem with it, it might be too late. So I'm concerned about the politics of it, yes, clearly.
Right, so then the big question is what lesson, I mean, having woken up to that realization, what lessons should we draw from that? What can we do about it, right? So there is a sense that we want to be more sensitive to the political economy, to the binding constraints, but how do we loosen those? So, you know, one approach could be, in order to get closer to the target, we may actually have to go slower, which is fine, but, you know, then we have to face the fact that we might miss, you know, the 1.5 by an even bigger margin. The alternative is to say the state needs to throw more money at this and basically buy off the opposition. And then there's a question, of course, like always in Europe, and we will talk about this in the context of monetary policy too. You know, how does this then fit together with the fact that we have a common climate objective for the entire European Union, but vastly different fiscal space?
Yeah, I mean, not easy, but I think, I mean, one important fact to have in mind is that the cost of decarbonization is very different from technology to technology and sector to sector. And I think we need to get our hands dirty. Stop having discussion on maybe this, or at the end of the day we'll see that. And we need to have some ideas about the numbers. And maybe one proposal I would make is, if you don't have any idea on the cost of, you know, carbon capture, green hydrogen versus blue hydrogen, the cost of a green electricity system between now and 10 years and 20 years, you should not be around the table. I really believe that is by looking at the cost of decarbonization technologies sector by sector, engaging with people, with farmers, with people in the construction sector, that you are going to be able to devise policies that not only make sense in terms of getting there, but allow for sufficient attention to the political constraints. I think what people need to understand, and it's very basics, but most people don't know that. I mean, gas at 20 euro per megawatt hour is very cheap energy. The climate transition is mostly about electrification. So if you look at the broad picture, it's really moving from gas at 20 to electricity at more than 100. You know, that's a big move. Now, gas has already moved from, you know, 20 to 30 to 50, but of course, you know, we've seen that. I mean, you know, industrial production in the energy intensive in Germany, minus 20%, that's big. One big question is where green electricity prices, I mean, a green electricity system will be in 2050. If you believe, and it's not impossible, it's going to go to 50, well, part of the issue of warming up, you know, warming houses might just be, you know, heat pump when possible, but maybe even electric converters will be affordable for, you know, rooms that you don't go too often to, or you sleep in, or whatever. If it's electricity at 150, it's a different story. Now, the good news, again, on the technology front is that electrifying from gas to electricity or oil to electricity, if it's heat pump or if it's electric cars, it's 3.5 times more efficient because of, you know, the physics of it. That means that you can afford, you know, electricity at, say, 70 euro is actually the same as gas at 20. But even there, I mean, we know that electric cars today are much more expensive than combustion engine cars. But if you talk to people in the sector, they say, you know, within 5 to 10 years, it's going to be on par. Then maybe waiting, at least for some part of the population, is a good idea. So this idea that we should rush on all these, no, let's look at it. If you believe that electric cars will be on par within 10 years, don't spend a huge amount of subsidies today, while it's only about waiting 5 to 10 years and then you don't have to give subsidies. And maybe you want to use those subsidies for research, for developing other value chains and so on. But that's again something that you will be able to do if you start having an understanding of the cost of technology. And then there is a problem of the narrative. We've sold, and Jean, of course, was probably the first one to point at that. We've sold the climate transition because we wanted to have some political support as a walk in the park. We would spend a lot of money, I mean, actually what they do in the US, but we don't have that money. And then it will be good news for everybody. And even the Commission has been coming with projections where, the transition would have a positive impact in more than half of their scenario on the economy. But then people are not prepared. And of course, when suddenly they see there is a cost, they're like, oh, that is not what I've been told. And honestly, even within the central banking community, when we have discussion, you have to remind people that it's a supply shock. I mean, we had recently a discussion on potential growth in a central banking environment. And there was one table where it was, impacts of the energy situation, minus on potential growth. And then a bit later, there was in the same table, impact of climate, plus minus, we don't know. And I was like, you don't know? What's the main instrument we're using in the industry? ETS. What is ETS? ETS is a price. So why would gas going from 20 to 50 because of Russia be clearly negative for growth, while it going from 50 to 80 because of carbon capture of blue hydrogen, we don't know? And then people are like, yeah, but if you say that, then it gives the impression you are... I mean, if we go about it like that, it's not going to work. I mean, let's stop being in denial. Let's discuss the issues where we face them. But the problem is when you say that, people look at you like, oh, he doesn't want to do it, or he's in denial, he doesn't think it's important. It's a negative supply shock. I mean, let's face it. And in the industry, with the IRA in the US and ETS in Europe, it's difficult.
So, the conventional rejoinder would be to say, sure, it's a negative supply shock, but, just like the continental blockade during the Napoleonic Wars triggered the industrial, or accelerated the industrial revolution in France, as the Spaniards say, there's no bad that does not come with something good. And I think what these people have in mind is this notion that we will see the type of innovation that you actually are optimistic about to a greater degree that may expand the technology frontier, trigger new growth possibilities. So, help us get rid of brown jobs. So this is aspirational and vague, but it's probably not completely wrong, right? And even in your brain, which works in interesting ways, in multiple ways, you do have your techno-optimistic side. So you should have some sympathy for this argument.
Yes, but time frame of political realities and what good news could come within 30 years. I mean, I don't know in 2050. It's very possible, and I really do believe that with the huge investments we are now making in the EV sector, electric vehicle sector, and in the renewable sector, that we are going to have relatively cheap green electricity with good storage solutions, and that within 30 years, indeed, the impact of greening the economy will be relatively limited. But even that is going to be more expensive than gas at 20 and then gas at 10 in the US. And then we have to survive it politically. till there. So it's not like I believe it's doable. I believe we will do it. But the issue of timing and the issue of surviving it politically by then is a real one.
Okay, and that issue has two dimensions. One is simply to get the buy-in to actually stay on course. So there's the political economy of making it happen. But then we have this whole other, even scarier dimension that has to do with European competitiveness, the future of energy-intensive industry, whether we have to completely revamp our growth model, for lack of a better term, how we do this. And this is, of course, a super difficult debate, particularly in my country, Germany. So what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, I think it's a very difficult one. Well, first, again, I mean, just to give the numbers, again, I insist on that, but it's US gas is at 10. Transporting green hydrogen from Chile is 4 times more expensive than US gas at 10. And that's only transport. So when I hear people say the future of industry in Europe is green hydrogen, well, by the time you have it, you don't have energy-intensive firms in Europe anymore. I think, I mean, part of it is just I don't know. We need to make the analysis. What is the share of electricity costs in some of these industries? We're going to lose part of the value chain. But the big question to me, and to which I don't have an answer, is if you lose part of the value chain that is very energy intensive, but maybe commodity-like, is it going to kill the rest of the value chain or not? You know, what are these economies of scope, of scale, of networks that are of importance here? Is it a problem if we lose ammonia production to the US and import ammonia, which actually happened during the COVID crisis? I once said maybe not, and then of course someone reminded me that we have some ammonia production in Antwerp, and I was like, don't say that. But that's a real question. If it's only about losing part of the most energy-intensive pieces of a value chain, but you can keep the rest, okay. But there is a real risk that all goes with it, and you know that people will go to Chile or will go to Northern Africa, and that you lose it all. And in some places it is also related, like you know, the Rhine volumes and Ludwigshafen and so on. There will be, I think, some reconcentration of industry, green industry in Europe in some places, because you will have network economies putting in place the technology for carbon capture and for hydrogen. And this will first take place in some of the big concentration of industrial activity in, you know, close to the sea. So there is also a geographic dimension. Like my understanding is in Antwerp, I think basically Europe is going to lose some market shares in the energy intensive sectors. That's basically by construction. But like Antwerp is probably well positioned within Europe, and there might be a few other places like that. Again, that's an analysis you want to do. But I really don't have an answer to what is the level of risk to the entire value chain. I would certainly not exclude that we should intervene. I mean, because the worst case scenario is that you close stuff that is more or less clean here to reopen it somewhere else and for it to be dirty, running on coal, electricity, somewhere else. And then politically you don't have an argument anymore. So I would certainly not exclude some form of support for these industries. The problem is then you open the Pandora box because, I mean, again, Europe is built on the basis of level playing field, single market and all that, and it took decades to build that. And if you open the Pandora's box and so you say, now you can, you know, it can go in all directions. So it's very difficult, actually.
Yes, I think, you know, most people at Bruegel would very much agree with your last set of statements. Both that it's very difficult, and second that the risk to the single market from opening that box is very high. By the way, I forgot to say at the beginning that there is, of course, a Slido code for those that want to make comments or ask questions online, and it's at Dynamics. So we should slowly move to talk a little bit about central banking, but sort of just as a bridge between climate and central banking. Let's talk a little bit about, you know, whether central banks have any role on climate policy, and if so, what the role should be. And so, you know, one could possibly think of building a prima facie case for the fact that they should have some role on some of the things that you have said so far, which is that this is a very complex problem. It's multidimensional. Just going for high carbon prices might not work, at least not in the short term. We may need multiple instruments, massaging the financial sector a little bit to differentiate costs of capital might be one such instrument. Maybe the central banks have good arguments to engage in such massaging because they are the protectors of financial stability. There isn't much evidence that banks are actually changing their portfolios. It's rather sticky. And so maybe just by doing their mandate on financial stability, central banks can have a constructive role here. So that would be, I think, a pretty conventional way of summarizing it. It is well known that you're skeptical of this argument. So tell us why you're skeptical.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is don't dream that you can green the financial system more than your economies. And sometimes I have the impression we want a green financial sector on top of a brown economy, and that's not going to be possible. The two will go hand in hand. And of course, the financial system will be green when our economy is going to be green. Whether you can accelerate one more than the other, I'm a little bit skeptical, but okay, also discussing with bankers. The role for monetary policy, three steps, two no-brainers and one more difficult issue. One no-brainer is we need to study it. We need to study the impact on inflation, on growth, and so on, but that's non-controversial. The other part, which is non-controversial and conceptually clear, is the risk as supervisor. If it entails risk of higher probabilities of default for some firms, as any other risk, we need to capture that. We need to ask banks to capture it, so on. I have sometimes the impression that we put a lot of pressure on banks to find risk that they don't see today, because honestly, their balance sheet, the average duration is 3 years, and I don't think there is a huge risk in terms of huge impact on PDs within a 3-year horizon. Then we make stress tests with a fixed balance sheet over a 30-year horizon, which I don't think makes a lot of sense. But that's, conceptually that we should look at risk, it's quite obvious. What is not clear to me is whether it should have a role in terms of, at the end of the day, allocative efficiency. That we should, change the relative prices, whichever way you put it. At the end of the day, it's about that. Well, typically, it's not what you would expect for monetary policy. When you look at economics textbooks, it's not like a monetary policy is an instrument for allocative efficiency. I haven't seen that in any textbook. So first reaction like, oh, this is a little bit of unusual. But then you want to look at whether the instrument would be efficient and whether it's part of the mandate. On the instrument being efficient, when Mario Draghi said whatever it takes, he had a very efficient instrument, just said one sentence, which had a huge impact. You can discuss whether it was, 200% within the mandate and what he really meant by that. But it was very efficient. And I have, a lot of admiration for what he did there. I don't think we have that in terms of greening the economy. I think we have third to fourth best instrument based on information that is of relatively bad quality. That's one thing. But the other part, of course, is the mandate. There is this support thing in Article 3. Part of the question is if you do it for climate, shouldn't you do it for other things? And if you choose climate compared to others, like supporting Ukraine, innovation, poor people or whatever, are you not doing politics? But then there is the ambiguity of support. And, if you are not, like me, a public economist by training, you might look at the issue and say, climate is very important. We are all in the same boat and everybody has to do its part. And we do on top of each other, we come with new initiatives and policies. I see it as, at the end of the day, you can summarize all what you do in a carbon price. I'm not pleading for only one instrument, but at the end of the day, it's about setting sort of an implicit price on carbon through different kinds of instruments. And then it's about an optimal level. And with a trade-off, it has a cost. Now, if you frame the discussion like that with a trade-off, then it's for politicians to decide what's the right trade-off. And supporting, well, there is no room for support, because if the optimal price, synthetic price is 50, and you add to that, claiming that you are supporting, you are actually doing autonomous policy making. You are changing a price that has been set by politicians. And so I don't think there is a lot of room to support without doing autonomous policy making. And Jay Powell was very clear. He said, we are not going to be climate policy makers. Honestly, the ECB has been less clear on that front. I don't think the rules of engagements are very clear conceptually. Now, honestly, it's a very academic and symbolic discussion. So I would not make a lot of fuss about it. I don't think it's an important one.
Will you still allow me one more question, then I'll let you off the hook. So just to make it a bit more concrete. I mean, first of all, we have to, of course, emphasize that I don't think anyone at the ECB is making this argument that the ECB is now about allocative efficiency, right? It's always brought in through the financial stability, which is, if you like, the least controversial among the secondary mandates that the objectives, not mandate. There's one mandate, only one mandate, and then there are secondary objectives that the ECB might have. Just to make it very concrete, so as far as I understand, and as you know, there's this an enormous and very comprehensive, very impressive report out in December, written by the ESRB ECB task force on what to do about climate change. Roughly, I don't know exactly what they're called. Many years of work, years of financial modeling, and one of the innovations is that in this final report, they do actually talk about green macroprudential policy. And so what this amounts to, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert, is that the central bank has existing macroprudential policy instruments, in particular capital buffers, and then borrower-based measures. And so the borrower-based measures refers to the borrowers of the banks, and so these are measures like debt service to income ratios. And so the idea is, well, maybe we should give these a green twist in the following sense. If you are a bank that isn't properly shifting its portfolio in the way that this task force thinks that it should be shifting, you're going to have to pay you're going to have a bigger capital buffer. And then, those instruments we do anyway for debt service to income. Maybe there is a rationale for adapting them. And I think that rationale comes out of that example that you started off with, which was, the cost of making a house more energy efficient. So I believe that the Latvians have, in fact, done that. So they apply a higher debt service to income threshold for housing that is efficient. And the argument, you can rationalize it as an adjustment to income, right? If you have an energy efficient apartment, then in a sense you're going to have to spend less in the indirect costs of this apartment, utility costs, which of course is something you want to count against a given income level, right? So that strikes me as being pretty innocuous. So is your point that the ECB should not be pushing those things, or that they are basically sort of second order in the big picture?
No, I think we should look at it, but the example you give looks to me more micro than macro. Banks look at their risk and they have capital requirements on the basis of that. If they can prove, and we are actually working on that in National Bank, and there are good arguments to prove that a house that is well isolated is worth more, and so that indeed it contributes to the to your capital ratios. But that's within the micro framework, and maybe there are some limitations that you want to discuss, but that's really bottom-up PDs and so on. So that's no-brainer, right? We should do it. Where it's more complicated than because macro-pru and systemic risk, it's more than that. It's saying at some point there might happen something, and that we discover that what we have been doing bottom-up is not enough, and that we should do more, for all banks together. And that's where we have these stress tests, and we have the orderly scenarios, the disorderly scenarios, and so on. Now, the problem is that these scenarios are based on policy shock. So, and honestly, how many people know here what's the price of ETS in the orderly and disorderly scenarios? Because we've been working so much on that, and we all know so much about it now. You don't know? Well, you should look at it, because it's 600 euro ETS in the orderly one, and it's 1,000 euro of ETS price in the disorderly one. That's an oil shock of 300
euro per barrel.
Today it's 64. I looked it up because I knew that Pierre was going to talk about this.
So what we are saying in those shocks is suddenly politicians realize we've not done enough. Look at the polls for the next election in Europe. Suddenly they realize we've not done enough, and they decide that the ETS price is to go to 1,000. And then we tell banks, you have a problem because politicians are going to do that. 300 euro per barrel, 200 euro per megawatt hour of gas. That's the shock in the disorderly scenario. Now we are saying banks, we believe that at some points politicians are going to create something which is worse than the oil shock we had in 22 with the war between Russia and Ukraine, and then sit there and do nothing. And so you have a problem, or you might have a problem. Well, okay, I'm not convinced, honestly. But again, look at the numbers. It's not only about concepts. It's about, and the problem if the numbers are lower, I mean, at the end of the day, the answer will be there is today probably no risk for financial stability coming from green. And why is it? Because the problem with climate, there is a lot of inertia in the system. So the risk is that before we see any big impact, it's too late. But exactly for the same reason, the risk is not so much that we are going to have a financial crisis. Because by the time you see the impact, it's too late. I mean, you have emitted too much carbon. That's why we need to work on mitigation, so that we don't get there. But that's also more or less by definition why I don't think it's a crisis like you would suddenly have a big, cyber crisis and then.
But just to understand, so I also agree that it's it's implausible, if not impossible, that we would have a policy-induced scenario that leads to those incredibly high ETS prices. But the implication of that, namely that politicians would want to avoid that, is that we may have much higher physical risks, right? Because that's the high temperature scenario. So the politicians are not going to commit suicide by creating that crisis, but the consequence is that climate change may just happen, and that may cause a risk to the economy. So I agree with you. It's not primarily a financial stability risk. It is a financial stability risk because the economy tanks. And so, that is captured on the radar of the central bank as a financial stability risk because they are freer to talk about that than about saying we want to prevent the collapse of the economy.
But then again, I mean, the balance sheet duration, average duration of balance sheet of a bank is 3 years. So if you have more physical risk, first it's going to be a bit more insurers first and then banks. Yes, it's going to increase the risk. And so it is going to increase the tariffs. But banks will adapt, I think. And that's where, again, to see something, we force a static balance sheet and we say, you're stuck with your customers till 2050 and they will go bankrupt 20 years from now. And where the banks say, yeah, but, I will see it coming and I won't renew my loan. And over that kind of period, I mean, in the US, all companies would be dead by 25 years. Not in Europe, and we keep 80% of them, but...
Okay, so, those of you that didn't know that Governor Wunsch is both interested in climate and knows a lot about it, came here because you expected something on monetary policy, and so we're not going to disappoint you, so I will ask the two obvious questions, and of course you're free to refuse to answer them. So the first obvious question is, I think there is general agreement, even the ultra-doves, I think, agree with that the ECB was too slow in raising rates. Why do you think that was?
Well, first, we're in good company, so that helps. Second, and I really want to insist on that, I think we were late, but I think at the end of the day, it probably mattered a bit for our reputation, but I don't think it did make any difference because then we catched up, and we catched up fast. And so, the first part of the inflation spike we had was a supply shock combined with some demand shock, but we could not really control it. And what we did with the 75 increases was enough to be there for the second round and third round effect. Now, okay, the question was, how did we get there? I think there was a dovish bias within the Governing Council. I mean, how many times have I not heard the 2011 mistake? Well, I hope that for the next generation of central banks, it will be the 2021 mistake.
So for those that don't know this, 2011 is that basically ECB tightened too fast after the global financial crisis.
Which was true, but I don't think, I mean, and then they changed after one or two meetings later. So part of it is models, and I think this is a huge problem. There are different ways to put it, but I mean, Christine Lagarde put it in her own way, but I have really some sympathy for what she said there. I mean, people that do spend a lot of time working with models, it's sometimes very, very hard to have a discussion on what's taking place in the real economy. And I'm not against models. We need models. It forces you to have discipline and so on. But really the models were telling us that lasting inflation was not possible. And you know, I'm that kind of guy. I told my people, if that's true, let's go on vacation. And then why should we be independent central bankers if we cannot have an inflation problem? Because if the problem is the lower bound and getting inflation instead of not getting inflation, then you should really not be independent. Give it back to politicians, and then you are very credible in terms of getting back to more inflation. So there was indeed, including in the academic profession, a huge bias in denial of the possibility of having higher inflation. And then there was something that had to do also in the US and other places with sort of mission creep on the mandate, this idea that we wanted to be good people, to do some outreach when at some point when the Fed objective was to create a high pressure economy, you were like, okay, high pressure economy, that leads to what? Could it lead maybe to inflation? It was a very specific, with after all these years of very, very low rates, a very specific and strange, if you look at it back from, with the benefit of insight situation for central bankers. And then I had a last one, which was, forward guidance. Yeah, I was against that kind of forward guidance. I think it was way too rigid. I had pleaded for an escape clause, and I think we paid some price for it, but at the end of the day, it was not that big. My real concern was that forward guidance would lead to financial stability issues. I was like, it's going to be financial stability or inflation. I thought financial stability. Some others thought inflation. They won. And I think it was better to have inflation than financial stability.
You thought it would be financial stability because it would force us to keep, very high liquidity when this would feed financial bubbles. That was the argument?
Yeah, I mean, the very low for very long. The end game for me, the only possible end game which would solve the model is that spreads would have had to go up, because long duration assets don't have a defined price if real interest rates are negative. So you need positive rates for the valuation to solve, and that means that you cannot have long duration risk-free assets anymore, or low risk. So all assets of some duration need to be very risky for the problem to solve.
I see.
And that's when you have a financial crisis.
Right. So one thing you didn't mention, but I suspect, in fact, we have written a paper arguing that this played a role, was a fear of, fragmentation or financial stability when risk rates go up, right? And so the argument we make in our paper is that the first two factors that you mentioned, to the extent that they played a role, they should have been, we should have been through this by February or March of 2022, because surely after inflation goes to 7.5% and we've had a huge supply shock from the Russian invasion, we wouldn't pay attention to these models anymore. But it still took us then 4 or 5 months to actually raise rates. Now you can say that was because of forward guidance, but even without forward guidance, maybe there would be a fear that if we do this without having something like the TPI, the Transmission Protection Instrument, ready, we are going to create a risk for countries like Italy. And indeed, spreads did go up during the period. So can you just confirm that we're not completely wrong with this argument?
Actually, I think I've already said that when I was at the Watchers last year. My formulation, because I'm trying to be cautious here, is we are flirting with a weak form of fiscal dominance. I mean, this idea that there is complete separation between fiscal and monetary, I think we are way past that. And there are examples in different directions. During COVID, of course, we had a very supportive monetary policy, but it was only effective because it allowed for a fiscal response. I mean, low interest rates, if you're stuck at home, are not going to help. It's only, because it allowed for a strong fiscal response that monetary policy was efficient. So there are interactions between fiscal and monetary. Sometimes we're very complementary during COVID. Sometimes we are not going in the same direction. Last year, fiscal, or the year before, fiscal was still supportive while monetary was becoming less supportive, and then we have one kind of problem. And then there is, of course, and indeed, the issue of what we can do or should do in terms of fragmentation. We have the TPI. I was very supportive of the TPI. And I really do believe that we need to have the instruments, because if we have a problem, then we don't have the time for very long discussions. And it's good that we have some instrument there that we can use. But the more I'm open to using instruments where we are in wartime, the more I believe we should be strict central bankers when we are in peacetime, and rebuild the buffers. And from that perspective, I don't see the rebuilding of the buffers in a number of countries. On average, if you look at Europe, yes, because Germany is doing it, some others. But there are a number of countries, of which the country I know best, that are not rebuilding buffers. And so, yes, we are still faced with a weak form of fiscal dominance. It's not going away. It's not going to go away, I believe. And so what was really in the treaty, which was making sure that monetary policy can operate independently of the fiscal situation, yes, we are not.
So I agree with you on the conclusion that it remains there, this weak form of fiscal dominance, and one can see it in the fact that the typical correlations of views in the ECB governing council, which does not include you, where you are you're a little outlier, sort of a large mile above the regression line, that essentially dovishness, hawkishness is correlated with the fiscal space of the country where the member comes from. I don't think that has gone away because of the TPI, but you would think that the TPI should have liberated, in a way, the council to just do the right thing, or certainly on the tightening side. And it did. In that moment, it did. But then there doesn't seem to be a structural impact in reducing this weak fiscal dominance, because you see the current policy debates, for example, on the operational framework, and you pretty much have that correlation. You don't need to comment on that if you don't want to.
No, at the end of the day, it's where is the discipline coming from? We know that discipline coming from markets is typically too late, too much of it. So we want the discipline to come probably from the rules, and of course we now are discussing those new rules. I don't have the impression they are going to be. Well, let's wait. But okay, I have the impression in the coming 2 years that the agreement that it should not be too binding. We have a number of countries in the euro area, so the likelihood that at least 2 or 3 of them will be in a difficult fiscal position is quite high.
And the reason, just to make it logically clear, why that would still influence the ECB, even though now we have the TPI, so ostensibly we can separate fragmentation risk from monetary policy making, is because it's an imperfect instrument, or because it's hard to decide what fundamental levels of spreads are, or what is the answer?
Well, you have, of course, the issue of when you would want to trigger, and I'm not going to comment too much on that. Of course, I think we've made clear that there was a gray zone, and I think we feel very comfortable defining that as a gray zone. I think it was very important that we would not get stuck with rules that would be too binding, and that we have some room for maneuver. I think we've got that. But it's only, the way I look at the TPI is not a structural solution. It's only about buying time. So honestly, the way I look at it is like, we have an instrument there that should contribute to avoiding moving to a bad equilibrium, but it's only, the first piece of the puzzle. Then you have to have some kind of structural solution behind that. So for me, it's really about, buying some time.
Right. By the way, we should apologize for using too many acronyms, being too geeky. So again, the TPIs, the transmission protection instruments, and the conditions that Governor Wunsch was referring to are 4 criteria that are summarized in a heading that is headlined eligibility. And so you would think of them as eligibility criteria, and those are: a country needs to comply with the fiscal rules, its debt must be sustainable, and then there are 2 criteria related to macro imbalances. So again, to sort of the good behavior under the EU governance framework. And so the idea is that, if a country gets into trouble, the ECB may come to the rescue without sending the country to the ESM, to a conditionality program, by intervening in the bond markets of that country, provided that the criteria are satisfied. But there is, if you look at it carefully, some ambiguity of whether they all have to be satisfied, whether each and every criteria is necessary. And I think probably the proper interpretation is that no single criterion is necessary, even though it would be very, very hard, I think, for the ECB to go and do this if a country has not observed the fiscal rules, right? So in that sense, I do actually think that this will help to enforce the fiscal rules to some extent. Okay. Good. Now, the last question on monetary policy, and so this is the unavoidable one. So for how long do you think rates should stay high? The euro area economy is weakening. All my dovish friends are jumping up and down, and does the ECB risk being behind the curve again, this time in the other direction?
What I really want to know is whether you have hawkish friends.
I have maybe I've lost my only hawkish friend after this conversation.
Maybe this is going to sound a little bit pretentious, but I don't like the etiquettes like hawkish, dovish. I like to think that it's about getting it right or wrong. I was quite dovish when I entered the governing council, and then I became known as very hawkish, probably, or quite hawkish. To be frank with you, if it would not be about remuneration that are still running it, depending on the measure, 4.5%. Momentum inflation is at 2. Growth is weak. We would already be talking about reducing rates if it would not be for wages, and I would be completely fine with that. But we have a problem. We have still wages running at a level which is not compatible with the 2%. So in our projections, there is a combination of wages going down. Going up growth of wages going down, and profit margins absorbing part of the shock. And we see that, at least on the profit margins fronts, and we have some indication that the dynamics of wage growth is decelerating, but not very strong ones. So there is, of course, we've had a quite long period now of high inflation. There is maybe here a bias for waiting a little bit to get more information. I think that has been mentioned quite clearly by many, including Philippe Lane. Now, let's be honest. We won't get full comfort within a reasonable period. So I think there is some value to wait to get some more data on wages, but at some point we are going to have to bet on where inflation is going. We won't have full comfort before we, I guess, probably start cutting rates. So I'm on the side of those that believe there is some value to waiting, but again, we won't get full comfort. So at some point we will have to look at all the information we have and take a bet.
As it turned out, many, if not most of the questions that we got in Slido were on this issue. And so here's one that could be interpreted as, pushing back slightly on the point that we should be too worried about wages. And the argument is whether So wage growth is worrisome. I don't think because we're worried about real wages getting too high, because they're still quite a bit lower, no, than at the beginning. Wage growth has still not nearly caught up with cumulative price growth, but because of these second round effects. Is it reasonable to think that in an environment where, clearly inflation has come down so much, so fast, we're still going to get these second round effects?
But the wage growth is a second round effect. It's basically, why is inflation going down now? Because workers have paid for the shock, except in Belgium. But real wages have gone down 4 or 5% in Europe, and that's why we have a situation which is very different from what we had with the oil shock in the 70s and 80s. But as you also just mentioned it, there is now some catching up, which I believe is fair. Gas
Yes.
prices have gone down, so
Yes.
It's fair that we're saying now, okay, we need to catch up. Real wage are still below 19, and we see them converging to the 19 level somewhere, I guess, in 25, end of 25. But that would still be 6 years of real wage stagnation. And we have tight labor markets. So, of course, the concern is that as soon as you have the beginning of a recovery in the economy, that you are again faced with these very tight labor markets, and that you might have wage growth running at 5%, going down to 4%, and then again reaccelerating because workers will say, "Hey, we didn't have any real wage increases for the last 5 or 6 years, and maybe they have a point."
Yes.
And this is a very specific situation that we've not known in Europe for decades. So our models are not calibrated on the basis of that reality. So again, at some point, it's going to be, what's your view on social relationships in Europe, and how far and fast workers are going to push for their piece of the cake? I don't know.
But cannot one take a slightly more kind of a drier economic view on this and ask what is the relative price change, the relative wage change following the supply shock that you would expect in the new equilibrium? And then we try not to obstruct that adjustment. And I presume, because this has been a bad terms of trade shock for Europe, that real wages would go down in the new steady state, but probably not as much as they have been. Do you think in these terms?
Yeah, gas prices are still higher than they were, but most of the shock is behind us. So, what would look normal would be, in theory, catch up with the level of 19 plus something. And then you have, of course, a discussion whether the share of the pie should move, because, of course, there was a significant decrease in the share of labor over the last 30, 40 years, and maybe it's even, you could say it took us, in some parts of Europe, 30 to 40 years to digest the previous oil shock, where there was a huge spike in the labor share. In some countries, it went to 80%. All firms were, from a macro point of view, not profitable. And that we actually did 30 years or 40 years of wage moderation in Europe so that we could go back to full employment in labor markets that are not extremely flexible. It's very conceivable with the demographics we're being faced with in Europe that, also the share of the pie will move again in the other direction.
That's right.
And maybe, honestly, when you see in the US, and I haven't seen numbers in Europe, but that low wages, the wages of lower paid workers are now growing faster than average or median wages. That is extremely good news. It's releasing some pressure from social security and state intervention, because the economy is producing less inequality than before. So that would be, in a way, a very good positive development, but on the inflation front, it would not be.
We have time for one round of questions from the audience. Let's start with Francesco, gentleman in the front row, and George, please. And identify yourselves.
So my question is about ECB and climate. Now you can say that the ECB has a 3-task monetary policy, micro supervision, and some kind of a macroprudential, which is less well defined. Do I understand from your exchanges so far that the real important activity of the ECB as regards climate would be on micro and macro rather than on monetary policy? That these are the areas where it is more important.
Kurt Geisert, I'm one of the guides in the House of European History. In the context of Belgian presidency, are you in contact with colleagues from the Western Balkans? And do you think that independency of central banks will be a topic for future enlargement?
Thank you. I'm Joel Dollars from Bruegel, and my question is about inflation in many, many years from now. So not how this current wage shock might play out. So do you think that, I mean, some of the factors which kept inflation very low in the pre-COVID era will return, and again, whoever will be in the governing council will have to face with the too low inflation, or there's a better chance of being close to 2%? Thank you.
Shall we go for the first three ones? So, I mean, there is a difference between what the ECB is doing and my personal opinion on that one. And again, I think it's mostly an academic debate. It's not very important because what we do is symbolic. But we are greening our monetary policy. We are, for instance, in terms of collateral, we are, changing the relative prices. And then, is it autonomous policy making? Is it supportive? I don't think we have decided how we read that and how we make the distinction between the two. So, yeah. But beyond that, probably the most important one is to get a good understanding of the risk from a micro perspective, the risk of probability of defaults in different sectors. But, if you look at sectors with big losses last year in Europe, probably the biggest losses of any sector was wind industry. So it's not because it's green that it's easy a walk in the park. I mean, you've got a very tough competition coming from China on the wind sector and of course solar panels and so on. And EVs, also coming from China. So sometimes we are like, if it's green, it's fine. If it's brown, most energy companies have had very high returns the last year, so they're more than safe. They don't need finance. I mean, I've heard bankers saying, I'm not going to finance the oil industry anymore. You know what? They don't need it. So that's easy. And they will most probably split their activities in between the dirty one and the clean one. They will go on the market for financing the green one, and they don't need to finance the brown one, because it's also to some extent going to be brought down to some extent in terms of investments. Western Balkans, I'm in contact with some of them because they are in the same constituency, but I'm not going to comment on central bank independence. Maybe on independence, I will add one thing. I think it's also useful to take some distance and look at what's taking place with the constitutional courts or the Supreme Courts in the US. And I'm liberal, so I think a lot of decisions that might have been taken before by the Supreme Court in the US I have a lot of sympathy with. But it's difficult to argue that it was not at all about politics. And now, of course, it's clearly about politics. But so, sometimes you feel like you're doing something because it's really going with the flow in society, and then it shifts, and then you're stuck in a bad place. The last question on the future of inflation, that's a good one. The honest answer is probably I don't have a good answer to that one. But there is, of course, this argument that demographic shock, tight labor markets, the green agenda, and so on, that our star is going to go up, and that we are not going to be faced with the China impact on inflation. And there are many considerations or reasons for why inflation should now be higher than it was in the last 20 years. I kind of buy these arguments in general, but I think it's very, very difficult to quantify them. Also on the impact of greening the economy and inflation. There is this theory that at the end of the day, that it's all about relative prices. So we've had in the past very, very high productivity gains in the 60s and 70s combined with inflation, and then we had low productivity gains combined with very low inflation. So, you know, when costs were going down in real terms, we had inflation. So these relationships are complex, and actually it's not defined. I mean, the theory is that you can anchor inflation at any level if you're credible. And that's really, at the end of the day, what is deciding on where inflation is going to go. But on the green one, you could say, okay, it's going to increase costs here and there. It's going to create new volatility in the lithium market and then in other market. But my take on it is that we've been walking on one leg, which is fossil fuels for many, many decades. And they were, you know, driving in a big way price movements. I mean, you had oil shocks, and then you had periods of very low oil prices, and they were driving a lot of movements in the markets. Now we are going to progressively walk on two legs, which is in the transition, oil and gas, you know, old stuff, but green. And you could say, in a way, it's going to average the shock. So we are going to have more sources of volatility, but they might cancel out. I mean, if you have high oil and gas prices, you accelerate on the green front. If you have very low oil and gas and you are, you know, faced with very high lithium prices, well, you know, you delay a little bit. Now, in Europe, you say you don't have that flexibility. Well, you do to some extent, but in the rest of the world, you certainly do have that flexibility. So I would not be surprised that at the end of the day, the combination of the two will be actually less volatility. Just to make the counter-argument of the argument that, you know, it necessarily has to go one way. I'm a contrarian, you know that.
Perfect. You think you can make an argument on variances, you know, Pierre points to a covariance, which completely undoes your argument. So that was great fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Great pleasure.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.